Three superpowers: Spain, Britain, the Soviet Union. All three of them followed the exact same seven-stage sequence before they collapsed. Not similar stages, the same stages, in the same order, every single time across 500 years of modern history. And right now, the United States has already completed 5 of them, not approaching stage 5, not nearing it, past it. We are standing between stage 5 and stage 6 of a pattern that has consumed every empire that has ever entered it. The Soviet Union made it to stage 5 before it ceased to exist in 900 days. Not from war, not from invasion, from economic implosion. Stage 6 is the loss of reserve currency status. Stage 7 is collapse. We are there right now. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you the exact sequence, what it looked like in real time when Spain entered it, when Britain entered it, when the USSR entered it. And then I'm going to show you where America sits today inside that same pattern, stage by stage, with evidence you cannot argue with. Because here is the thing that every collapsing empire has in common beyond the stages themselves. Every single one of them believed they were the exception. Spain believed the silver made them permanent. Britain believed the empire made them permanent. The Soviet Union believed the ideology made them permanent. All of them were wrong in the same way. The pattern does not care about exceptionalism. It does not negotiate with military power or technological advantage or the accumulated confidence of a civilization that has never known what it feels like to lose. It is mathematical. It is sequential. And once you are inside it past stage 3, no empire in recorded history has ever reversed course. We are on stage 5. Let me show you how we got here, why the people running the country either cannot see it or will not say it, and what the sequence tells us is coming next. Before we go through the pattern stage by stage, you need to understand what imperial collapse actually looks like in practice. Not in a textbook, not in a documentary, but in the lived reality of ordinary people whose civilization was the most powerful in the world and who watched it dissolve within a single lifetime. Imperial collapse does not begin with a military defeat. It does not begin with an invasion or a dramatic fall of a capital city. It begins with economic exhaustion that is invisible at first. The empire extends beyond its ability to sustain itself. Military bases across the globe, wars on multiple fronts, domestic promises it cannot keep, foreign debts it cannot repay. In the early stages, nothing feels catastrophically wrong. The currency still functions. The military still wins battles. The government still makes promises with apparent authority. But beneath the visible surface, the foundation is fracturing. Resources are flowing to sustain the structure of power rather than build new productive capacity. The best and most capable people begin leaving for places where the opportunity is real rather than borrowed. Trade partners begin quietly exploring alternatives. Allies begin hedging their bets rather than deepening their commitment. And then comes the acceleration, the phase where the invisible deterioration becomes visible faster than the institutions that are supposed to manage it can respond. Enemies test boundaries that were previously uncrossable. The currency that was once desperately sought by every nation on earth begins coming back home. The militaries spread across the world becomes a liability rather than a projection of strength. The promises that were once backed by genuine power become obviously empty. This is not theoretical. This is precisely what happened to Spain, to Britain, and to the Soviet Union. And it happened because all three of them made exactly the same decisions in exactly the same sequence that the United States is making right now. They believed their power was self-sustaining, and they overextended militarily beyond what their economy could support. They debased their currency to pay for obligations their tax revenue could not cover. They lost productive capacity as consumption replaced creation, and they refused to accept the reality of their trajectory until the collapse was already underway and irreversible. Let me take you through each collapse in sequence, because the details matter. The pattern is not just structurally identical across all three empires. The specific mechanisms are so similar that reading the history of Spain in 1590 feels like reading a description of the United States in 2026. Spain in the 1500s and 1600s is the original blueprint, and it is the most instructive collapse in the entire historical record because it happened in an era of genuine abundance. This was not a civilization destroyed by scarcity. It was a civilization destroyed by mismanagement of extraordinary wealth. After Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, Spain became the first true global superpower. The conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires gave them access to the richest gold and silver deposits ever discovered in human history. By 1550, Spanish galleons were delivering 200 tons of silver annually to the Spanish crown. By 1600, 400 tons per year. Spain controlled the money supply of the entire European continent. The Spanish real was the global reserve currency. Every major trade transaction across Europe, the Mediterranean, and the known world was denominated in Spanish silver. Sound familiar? Sound. This is where the pattern always begins, with a nation that controls the world's money supply and comes to believe that control is permanent. King Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, commanded more financial resources than any monarch in recorded history. And he deployed all of them on empire. Spain fought wars simultaneously against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, against France, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, against England's navy in the Philippines, and across the Americas. By 1580, Spain had active military commitments on 4 continents. Half of all Spanish government revenue was consumed by military spending, and still it was not enough to sustain all of the commitments simultaneously. When the tax revenue proved insufficient, the Spanish crown did what every empire does at this stage of the pattern. They debased the currency. Silver coins that were supposed to be struck at nearly pure silver content began being mixed with copper. A coin that was once 90% silver became 50% copper, then 75% copper. The face value remained identical on the surface of the coin. The real value had been quietly gutted. Merchants noticed, they always do. Prices rose to compensate for the deterioration of the currency. Inflation destabilized the trade network that the silver had once anchored. Simultaneously, Spain began borrowing at extraordinary scale, from Italian bankers, from German bankers, from anyone who would extend credit to the empire that controlled the world's silver supply. By 1557, less than 20 years into Philip's reign, Spain declared bankruptcy for the first time. They defaulted, restructured their debts, and kept spending. They declared bankruptcy again in 1560, then in 1575, then in 1596, 4 bankruptcies in 40 years. Each time the promises of reform were made, each time the borrowing resumed almost immediately. But here's the dimension of Spain's collapse that almost never gets told, the part that makes it the most direct mirror of America's current situation. Spain had all the gold and silver in the world, and it destroyed them. Not immediately and not obviously, but the abundance of monetary wealth created an incentive structure that hollowed out the productive economy over generations. Why build ships when you can buy them from the Dutch? Why grow food when you can import it from France? Why develop manufacturing when silver can purchase whatever you need from whoever produces it? Spanish nobility came to consider physical labor and commercial activity beneath them. Manufacturing declined. Agriculture stagnated. The creative and entrepreneurial energy that had driven the conquest, the genuine productive capacity that had made Spain powerful, atrophied from disuse. All the silver from the Americas flowed through Spain and directly back out to pay for French wine, Italian luxury goods, and Dutch manufacturing. Spain became a conduit for wealth rather than a creator of it. When the silver mines began depleting, when annual production began its inevitable decline, there was nothing left underneath the monetary abundance to sustain the structure. The entire system, the military, the political authority, the social order, all of it had been built on the assumption that the silver would keep flowing. When it slowed, Spain did not decline gradually, it collapsed in stages, each stage faster than the last. By 1640, they lost Portugal. By 1650, the Netherlands, their wealthiest territory, was gone. By 1700, the empire was a shell, still large on paper, still projecting the imagery of power, but economically dead at its core. A civilization that had controlled the wealth of 2 hemispheres became a secondary regional power within a single century, and it never recovered. Spain today is a pleasant European country, a tourist destination culturally rich and geopolitically irrelevant. The descendants of the people who conquered 2 continents and controlled the world's money supply have no meaningful influence on global events. That is what the end of the pattern looks like from the outside, decades after the collapse. Now, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments. The Recession Warnings community is global, and I want to know where you're tuning in from, because what I'm about to show you about Britain and the Soviet Union affects every one of you, regardless of which country you're in. 300 years after Spain's peak, Britain occupied the same position. The nation that ran the global monetary system, that controlled the world's most critical trade routes, that maintained military dominance across multiple continents, and that believed its position was a permanent feature of the world order rather than a circumstance dependent on continued productive superiority. At its height, around 1900, Britain controlled 25% of the world's land surface and governed 400 million subjects across 6 continents. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. Every major trade contract was denominated in pounds. Every central bank held British bonds as their primary reserve asset. London was the financial capital of the world by an order of magnitude. And just as Spain had believed 3 centuries earlier, Britain believed this was simply the natural order, that the advantages of empire were self-sustaining rather than built on ongoing productive superiority that required continuous reinvestment to maintain. The pattern had already begun, but from the inside it was invisible. Britain's military commitments in India, across Africa, across the Middle East, in China, in the Pacific, and throughout the Caribbean consumed a growing share of national resources that was not being invested in maintaining the industrial and technological edge that had originally made British power possible. When World War I began in 1914, Britain faced a decision that crystallized the dilemma every overextended empire eventually confronts. The cost of fighting was economically catastrophic. The cost of not fighting, of allowing Germany to dominate Europe and potentially threaten the trade routes on which British prosperity depended, seemed worse. They chose to fight. World War I cost Britain the equivalent of over $1 trillion in today's purchasing power. They borrowed the majority of that from the United States, and by 1918, Britain had gone from being America's creditor to being America's largest debtor. They had won the war, but begun the transfer of financial supremacy that would define the rest of the century. They kept the empire. They maintained the form of global power, but the foundation had shifted in a way that the institutions managing British policy either did not fully understand or refused to acknowledge publicly. The interwar period was the stage where British financial repression began in earnest. The government kept interest rates suppressed to manage war debt. Savers and bondholders earned below inflation returns for years. The pound was maintained at an artificially high exchange rate to preserve the image of financial strength, an image that the underlying productive numbers could no longer actually support. Then World War II consumed whatever financial reserves the First War had left intact. By 1945, Britain was essentially bankrupt. They won the war against Germany through a combination of genuine courage, American industrial output, and Soviet manpower. But they paid for their survival with the empire. American financial support during the war came with conditions. The gradual dismantling of the British imperial trading system that had given the pound its reserve currency status. Between 1945 and 1950, Britain liquidated its empire with a speed that shocked even the people who had predicted it was unsustainable. India in 1947, Palestine in 1948. The process of withdrawal from territory after territory was driven not by ideology, but by the simple mathematical reality that Britain could no longer afford to administer and defend what it claimed to govern. The pound, which had been the world's reserve currency for over a century, was devalued repeatedly. From being the currency everyone needed, it became a currency people needed to exit before the next devaluation. By 1956, the Suez Crisis made the shift in global power visible to everyone who had still been looking away. Britain and France attempted to reclaim control of the Suez Canal and were stopped, not by military failure, but by American financial pressure. The United States threatened to sell British pound reserves, which would have collapsed the currency. Britain had to stand down. The empire that had defined the world for a century could not defy the creditor that now held its financial fate. That moment, when Britain realized that American financial power superseded British military decision-making, is the clearest single illustration in modern history of what happens when you transition from creditor to debtor while trying to maintain the posture of the dominant power. The form of empire remained for a few more years. The substance was already gone. Within 40 years of their peak, Britain had lost the empire, lost reserve currency status, lost financial supremacy, and accepted a permanent role as America's junior partner. The pattern had completed itself again. The Soviet collapse is the most instructive example of the three for an American audience in 2026, not because the United States is a communist country, but because the Soviet Union's collapse happened within living memory, happened with extraordinary speed, and happened to a military superpower with nuclear weapons and global reach that had given its citizens every reason to believe the system was too large and too powerful to fail. The Soviet Union did not decline over centuries the way Spain did. It did not spend decades in managed retreat the way Britain did. It went from superpower to non-existent in 900 days. 900 days from the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 to the formal dissolution of the USSR on December 26, 1991. That speed is the lesson. When the pattern reaches its terminal stages in a modern complex economy, the collapse does not give warning. It does not unfold gradually enough for ordinary people to reposition themselves. It happens faster than the institutions managing it can respond, faster than the media can frame it, and faster than most individuals can protect themselves. The Soviet Union, at its height in the 1970s, was a genuine peer competitor to the United States in every meaningful dimension of geopolitical power. Nuclear arsenal, military reach, space technology, global alliances, ideological influence across dozens of countries. From the outside, it appeared as a permanent feature of global order. From the inside, the foundation was already failing in ways that the official narrative was structurally incapable of acknowledging. The military consumed 15 to 20% of Soviet GDP, triple the share that the United States was spending, to maintain rough parity with an economy that was 3 to 4 times the size. They had to match American technology, American reach, and American alliance systems with a fraction of the underlying productive capacity. The Soviet economy stopped genuinely growing in the 1970s. Oil revenue masked the stagnation for over a decade, but underneath the oil income, the productive economy was deteriorating steadily. Factories produced goods of declining quality. Agricultural output failed consistently despite some of the most naturally productive farmland on Earth. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was importing grain, a country with vast fertile territory that could not feed its own population under central planning. Technology fell decades behind the West across nearly every civilian sector. And when oil prices collapsed in the mid-1980s, the external revenue that had been masking internal economic failure disappeared simultaneously. The Soviet ruble was never a real international currency. Soviet citizens who could obtain dollars did so precisely because they understood intuitively that their own currency was not a genuine store of value. The government was purchasing foreign goods and technology with gold and oil because no one in the international market wanted rubles. When the gold reserves began depleting and oil revenue collapsed, the Soviet Union ran out of the hard currency it needed to sustain even the minimum requirements of the system. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, were genuine attempts to address the underlying dysfunction before it became fatal. They accelerated the collapse instead, because they loosened the political control that had been suppressing the visible expression of the economic failure without fixing the economic failure itself. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, the Eastern European satellite states that had provided the Soviet Union with strategic depth and ideological validation were gone within months. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, East Germany, all gone in a single year. Without the ability to pay the military adequately, without the economic foundation to sustain the political structure, without the credibility that comes from a functioning currency and a productive economy, the center could not hold. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist. No invasion, no military defeat, economic implosion. A nation with 30,000 nuclear weapons was undone by the inability to maintain a functioning economy and a credible currency. The pattern had consumed its third superpower. Now, look at the United States and look carefully, because every stage of this pattern is visible in the present data, if you are willing to see it without the filter of exceptionalism that has caused every previous empire to misread its own trajectory. The United States currently maintains over 750 military bases across 80 countries and has active troop deployments in over 150 nations. The annual military budget stands at $850 billion or more than the next 10 countries combined. And simultaneously, recruitment is below target, equipment is aging faster than it can be replaced, and strategic analysts are openly acknowledging that the U.S. cannot respond to simultaneous crises in Europe, the Pacific, and the Middle East at current resource levels. The commitment to defend NATO allies, to maintain a credible deterrent against China in the Pacific, to sustain Middle Eastern stability, and to project global power cannot all be honored simultaneously with the forces and the budget currently available. This is stage one of the pattern, military overextension, and it is not a political opinion. It is an operational assessment that the military establishment itself has begun to articulate in its own planning documents. The dollar has lost approximately 98% of its purchasing power since 1971, when Nixon ended the dollar's convertibility to gold and transformed the global monetary system into a pure fiat structure. Since 2000, the U.S. money supply has increased by 400%. Since 2020 alone, over $6 trillion were created. The coins are no longer being debased with copper because there are no longer coins. There is only the printing of digital currency with no constraint except the political willingness to stop. This is stage two, currency debasement, executed through modern mechanisms that produce identical results to the copper and silver manipulation that destroyed the denarius and the Spanish real before it. The national debt stands at $36 trillion, representing 120% of GDP. Interest payments on that debt are approaching $1 trillion annually, more than the United States spends on defense. The government borrowed $1.8 trillion in fiscal 2024 during a period of relative economic growth and peace, which means the deficit is structural rather than crisis-driven. Borrowing is required simply to pay the interest on previous borrowing. Spain declared bankruptcy 4 times. Britain borrowed until the empire collapsed under the weight of its obligations. The Soviet Union ran out of hard currency and gold reserves. The mechanism in each case was identical to what the U.S. debt trajectory shows today. This is stage 3, the debt spiral, and it is mathematically confirmed rather than analytically speculated. American manufacturing as a share of GDP has declined from approximately 28% in 1953 to under 11% today. The United States imports $800 billion more than it exports annually. Critical supply chains, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, steel, rare earth minerals essential to military hardware, run through foreign countries, primarily adversaries or nations, that would face severe pressure from adversaries in a geopolitical crisis. The pandemic made this visible in ways that were temporarily disturbing and then systematically forgotten by the political class, just as Spain became a conduit for silver that flowed through it and back out to pay for imports it no longer produced domestically. The United States has become a conduit for dollars that flow out and return as consumer goods produced by the nations that are now its primary geopolitical rivals. This is stage 4, loss of productive capacity, and it has been proceeding for 50 years. Trust in American institutions measured across decades of consistent polling has reached historic lows that span every major institution: government, media, finance, medicine, and law. 100,000 Americans die from drug overdoses annually. Homelessness in major American cities is visible at a scale that has no precedent in the post-war era. Political dysfunction has reached the point where the basic functions of governance, passing budgets, confirming appointments, maintaining basic infrastructure, are routinely held hostage to factional conflict. Fertility rates have collapsed below replacement level. The social cohesion that allows a complex civilization to coordinate and sustain itself is visibly eroding. This is stage 5, social decay, and it is not a partisan observation. The data is consistent across every political framing of the underlying reality. 5 stages completed, 2 remaining. Stage 6 is the loss of reserve currency status, the moment when enough of the world has found alternatives to dollar-denominated trade that the demand for dollars falls structurally, and the dollars the United States has exported to the world as the price of reserve currency status begin flowing back home in quantities that domestic inflation cannot absorb. The evidence for the early movement toward stage 6 is already present. BRICS nations have been actively developing alternative payment and settlement systems outside the dollar architecture. Central banks globally have been accumulating gold at the fastest pace since 1967, the year before the last major restructuring of the dollar system. China and Russia have formalized bilateral trade in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia has publicly discussed accepting currencies other than the dollar for oil sales, which would directly undermine the petrodollar arrangement that has been a cornerstone of dollar reserve status since 1974. These are early signals, not the completed stage. But every previous empire in this pattern showed identical early signals before the stage completed, and in every previous case, the completion was faster than the consensus expected. Stage 7 is collapse, not the gradual managed decline that American political culture imagines when it pictures American power diminishing. The Soviet Union's stage 7 lasted 900 days. Britain's was slower but driven by external financial coercion that the British government had no tools to resist. Spain's was drawn out over decades, but driven by the same fundamental dynamic: a monetary system that had lost its foundation, a military that could not be sustained, and a productive economy that had atrophied beyond the point of recovery within any time frame relevant to the people living through it. The people who understand this pattern are not waiting for official confirmation that stage 6 has begun. Official confirmation arrives after the stage has completed, not before. The central banks buying gold right now are buying it because they understand what gold has represented in every previous monetary reset, the asset that retains its exchange value across the transition from one monetary architecture to the next. The investors building positions in real assets and commodities and currencies outside the dollar system are not making speculative bets. They are making the same calculation that the Spanish nobility who converted their debased reales into land and grain made in the 1590s. They are making the same calculation that the British investors who moved capital into American assets made in the 1930s and 1940s. They understand that the pattern completes itself. The question they are answering with their money is not whether the pattern will complete. The question is what holds value across the transition. The answer that history provides consistently across every version of this pattern across 500 years and 3 complete collapses is that the assets which survive are the ones that maintain exchange value independent of the monetary and political system that is collapsing. Physical gold has survived every monetary reset in recorded history. Productive land and real assets that generate essential goods have survived every collapse. Skills that address fundamental human needs have maintained their exchange value through every currency failure. And positioned capital, cash or hard assets held by people who understood the pattern early enough to be ready to acquire distressed assets at collapsed prices, has been the foundation of the fortunes built by the families who came through every collapse in a stronger position than they entered it. The Spanish families who had converted silver into land before the debasement completed held their position. The British investors who had diversified into American and international assets before the pound's final collapse protected their purchasing power. The Soviet citizens who had accumulated dollars or hard assets before the ruble became worthless had options that their neighbors did not. The pattern is not secret. The mechanism is not complex. The only genuine barrier to understanding it is the same barrier that has always existed: the psychological resistance to accepting that the system you live inside, the system that your entire financial life is organized around, is in the terminal stages of a collapse sequence that has consumed every empire that has ever entered it. 3 empires followed this pattern to its conclusion. Spain believed the silver made them exceptional. Britain believed the empire made them exceptional. The Soviet Union believed the ideology made them exceptional. All three were wrong in the same way. The pattern consumed all three of them on the same timeline once stage 3 was complete. The United States has completed 5 stages. The evidence is not ambiguous. The mathematics are not uncertain. The historical precedent is not limited or weak. It is 3 complete data points from the most powerful civilizations of the last 500 years, all following the same sequence to the same conclusion. Maybe this time is different. Maybe American exceptionalism is a genuine feature of history rather than the same story every empire tells itself before the pattern completes. But the pattern does not respond to exceptionalism. It responds to mathematics. And the mathematics of $36 trillion in debt, of currency that has lost 98% of its purchasing power, of military commitments that exceed the productive capacity to fund them, of supply chains that run through adversaries, of social cohesion that is visibly deteriorating. That mathematics says the same thing it said in Madrid in 1600, in London in 1945, and in Moscow in 1989. The pattern is completing. The sequence is locked. And the only question that matters now is not whether it happens. The only question is what you are holding when it does. Subscribe to recession warnings. Because stage 6 is not a future event we are predicting. It is a current process we are documenting. And when it completes, you will not have time to understand what happened and then reposition. You will need to have understood it before. That is what this channel exists for. The answers are in the pattern. The pattern is in the history. And the history says we are almost out of time.